Okay, well, let's get started. I don't want to keep you waiting much longer. So thank you all for being making yourselves available to attend this second part of the expert seminar, The Impact of Religious Freedom Research, which is a collaboration between Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and the International Journal for Religious Freedom. So as you know, we had our first session last week. Well, because our discussions were so lively and so interesting, we didn't have the time to complete it all, and so that's why we have this the second part today. So in the first session we discussed the first set of papers, and now we'll be looking at 5 more papers, last but not least, I would say. So thank you all for being here, for being available. I just would like to remind you to please all mute your phones when you're not talking. And if you can, if you're comfortable with that, please turn your cameras on to make this as natural as possible. Even though this is a virtual meeting, we want this to be as personal as possible. And so please remember, the presenters all will get 7 minutes to present, and then the discussant that was assigned to each paper will get 3 minutes to respond, and then there will be opportunity for questions and answers. And everyone is welcome to ask questions, not only authors, but also other participants. Remember also that we are recording this session and that it's open to the public, so you're aware of this. Govert Buys, Professor of Philosophy at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, will chair this meeting today. We will try to be done by 5 p.m. Amsterdam time. Before I give the chair to Govert, I would like to invite Christoph Sauer, the director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom, to say a brief word of welcome. Christoph, please, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That is a nice privilege. Could you please allow me to share my screen?
Yes, actually, Christoph, you can share it already.
No. It says the host has deactivated screen sharing for participants.
Oh, well, that's strange. Let me see what I can do.
Okay, apologies. But it's my privilege to welcome you on behalf of the International Institute for Religious Freedom, which is a research platform that operates globally and which, when it started around 2005, had chosen to go under the auspices of the World Evangelical Alliance. We immediately have a global body to serve. So let me just quickly illustrate what the Institute does with a very few publications to characterize it, and then you will see how this conference fits in with the journal. So we have this Religious Freedom series, where, for example, we published Heine Bielefeld's presentations at the United Nations, or other research on defining persecution. There's another series on Christians under pressure, which only started recently. And there's a global issue series, also dealing with persecution in some of the topics. And on the right-hand side, you see the International Journal for Religious Freedom, in which your papers are hopefully all published, obviously pending peer review. So this is just to give you a bit of an array of various publications that the International Institute for Religious Freedom does. So we link researchers on freedom of religion or belief matters across the continents, and we're privileged to be part of this wonderful initiative that Dennis has spearheaded, and it's been my privilege to watch him grow and develop over the years, developing many good initiatives. So thank you very much for the privilege of being part of this. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for your kind words. And thank you also for opening the journal, the International Journal for Religious Freedom, to us, which is where we will be publishing the papers that are presented during this expert seminar. Of course, after a serious peer review session. So remember, please, to all mute your phones when you're not talking. Leave your cameras on. If you're comfortable, and if you would like to ask any question, please use the chat function and direct your questions to Govert Buys, who will be chairing this session today. Govert, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dennis, for opening this, and thank you as well, Christoph, for giving this word of welcome and drawing attention to all the interesting and good work that you are doing. So thank you. Yeah, and well, I'm glad that you are all here, that we can continue our session of last week. And as Dennis will be one of the presenters in this part of the session, I think it is good for me that I can be chair, so that he can concentrate on his presentation later on as well. Okay, yeah, I think the first paper that we have that we just were not able to deal with last week was by Luc Paris. Basically, I think, yeah, very much, yeah, you can say almost the most tender, more or kind of similar theme as was raised in James Wallace, or in Jason Kloschek's paper about the challenge of religious freedom. Here it is assessing the public support for international religious freedom, especially in the United States. So thank you very much, and perhaps you would like to take the floor and present, give us a kind of overview of the main points in 7 minutes, basically. So the floor is yours. Yeah, unmute. Yeah, okay, yeah, there you go.
Muting myself. I want to make sure that we are mindful on time, so hopefully I can keep this down to under 7 minutes, and I'm going to mainly focus on the highlights. My project basically asks a really basic research question, which is, what do Americans actually think about international religious freedom? The motivation for the project began out of my dissertation, which is my current book project that I'm working on, which looks at the development of international religious freedom as a foreign policy objective in U.S. grand strategy. And in there, I argue that the U.S. has actually been promoting international religious freedom for well over a century. There are antecedents that go into the 19th century, but they're very kind of inchoate and ad hoc. There's sort of not a lot of consistency. After the Cold War, not only is there a great amount of consistency, there is also... Oh, beg your pardon? Did we lose me?
No, I think everybody should really mute his or her microphone, and perhaps you could speak a little bit more into the microphone, Luke. Perhaps that, yeah?
Let's try that. Let me try one thing. All right, can you hear me better now?
Go ahead. Yes, that's better. Yeah.
So anyway, in my dissertation, I sort of basically argue that the Cold War fused international religious freedom and American foreign policy, and that's a whole separate conversation. I do make some mention of it in the paper, but for the sake of time, I'll let readers sort of skim that and feel free to question me more. But for this project, I began to think, well, what do Americans actually think about this? There's a lot of literature in public opinion and foreign policy about what the links are between what American, respondent attitudes are about specific policy issues and what, the American government does. And generally, there's believed to be a weak link, sort of direct link on foreign policy issues, although there are indirect links, and other times there might be some cueing from elites to voters and the Americans about sort of what they should be thinking about this. What I found in the literature on religious freedom, however, especially in U.S. foreign policy, is that typically the questions ask, what do religious people think about specific foreign policy issues? So if you're a Christian or a Baptist or an atheist or Muslim, what do you think about foreign policy issue X or Y or Z? No one's actually ever said, what do all Americans think about this other aspect of religious freedom, which is all of the policies and the initiatives that the United States government does. Many of you are probably familiar with the International Religious Freedom Act of '98. You're probably familiar with the annual report from the U.S. State Department. There are additional sanctions that are possible that a president can exercise. And so I basically, in my set of research questions we have every 2 years, there's a congressional election survey. There's one coming up this summer and fall. So if you have maybe suggestions on better questions I could be asking, feel free to email me those. I might be able to sneak a few in if I get a chance to do this again. However, 2 years ago, I basically notified respondents to this survey that, hey, here are these policies. And, what do you think that makes America safer? And then I asked just a handful of control variables. Some of them are standard across the data set. Obviously, gender, party ID. So, how strongly or weakly are they Democrat or conservative or Republican, et cetera. Levels of education, knowledge about foreign policy. And then I just began to sort of work through some of the findings there. And what I find to get to the results and keep us on time is that the only real kind of consistent theme is that with the standard control variables like gender or education, there's no real strong indication that any of those will predict or related to what people think about religious freedom. There is high school education, for example, or education broadly, is not consistent. So, for example, those with a 2-year degree or a high school diploma are more likely to support religious freedom, but those with a high school degree or no high school degree or a 4-year degree or above are less. So there's kind of this, like, you would expect a linear relationship in one direction or another, and that doesn't seem to be there. Women tend to be less supportive of international religious freedom relative to men, but I don't exactly know why that might be the case, unless they tend to be typically they tend to be more democratic or more liberal, so they might be more secular. But I'm not sure that that's the case. I'd have to think through what's going on there. What I did find when looking at foreign policy issues, however, is the only group of respondents that think that, when asked what they think the most important national security issue is for the United States, only those who think long-term competition with China are statistically likely to also think international religious freedom makes the U.S. safer. And so in the paper, I sort of speculate, and I want to test this again in the future. I think it might actually be because readers who think that China is the most important national security issue for the United States are also attuned to China's abuse of religious freedom. And so they may be making the same kinds of strategic connections that policymakers were doing during the Cold War. So those are my findings that I have. I'm trying to think through again, as I've said, what I can do better on this second go around for CCES election survey this summer. And I'll cede the time to my respondent and some Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke, there for this short and clear introduction. I think on the respondents on the list are either Niels or Anton, Niels de Nutte or Anton van Dijk. So I don't know who is going to take the floor. Niels?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It will be
The
me,
floor is
Steve.
yours.
Thank you. Anton was excused today. He couldn't make it, I'm afraid. Look, thank you for your paper. It was quite a lengthy one and interesting, but I'll just present you with some questions that came to mind as I was reading, I think. First of all, last week, there was a lot of debate going on the different definitions and conceptions of what religious freedom is about. And in your paper, you obviously use a specific definition, but you're not very explicit about it, not at the get-go. So it might be interesting as a reader, in any case, to know which definition you use or what is the conception of freedom is as you see it. And second, a question that I have regarding that definition: did all your respondents of the survey understand or know what that conception of religious freedom was, and did they all agree on it? Because that might be a factor as well. Thirdly, on Republicans, which was interesting, is that as they are more likely to support international religious freedom, again, what type then of freedom? Because I might imagine they would prefer a religious freedom resembling religious conceptions that mirror their own, or are they very open about it? That's a question that came to mind. Then on page 4 and page 14 of your paper, you touch upon state atheism and the emergence of the US as a protector of Christendom. I think the paper might benefit as well from highlighting not only the positive consequences, but the negative ones internally for the US as well, of McCarthyism and the repercussions of that for secular people and the, socialism, etc. And I was thinking, my fifth question, that was a question out of interest. On page 2, you say that atheism was added as a protected religious clause as well. I'd be very interesting in knowing how that came about, which pressure groups were involved, or because that would be interesting to know how they actually managed to do that and why they managed to do that. So I think that's about it. I hope it's helpful. But thank you anyway for your presentation and your paper.
Okay, thank you, Niels, for a couple of very clear questions. Luke, do you want to give a response to them?
Yeah, I think I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. Let me start with the last one on atheism. There might be a way for me to get at how that came about, but I think it would go beyond the scope of the paper. It would require, I think it's doable, but it would require getting into the legislative record and then maybe talking to staff members in Congress, of which I know a handful. I could reach out to them and begin to sort of work backwards on who was involved in that. My general sense, however, is the literature on religious freedom in the United States has been one of ever increasing expansion. Philip Hamburger has a law book, a legal history book, Separation of Church and State. And one of his general arguments is that what you see in 19th century religious freedom, it's obviously focused mainly on white Protestants. It's exclusionary of Catholics and just about everyone else. And then throughout the 20th century, you begin to see an ever increasing expansion. So first Catholics get included, then Jews, then Muslims, then non-Christians, and so I think it's just part of this general trend that in the United States, there tends to be this expansionist view, so non-religious belief is now considered religious belief, right? So that's what I think is going on there. As a strategy matter, which is often how I approach most of these questions, it makes perfect sense to me that you would want to protect atheists if you think you want to use some of the foreign policy mechanisms, for people that are in religious state. So if you're a policymaker and you're concerned about, let's say, anybody in Iran who's not sort of subscribing to the state religion, all of them get classified as atheists, right? But especially atheists. And so you want tools to say, I want to be able to use the foreign policy mechanisms that we have. I want to be able to sanction people for violence. So you just throw it in the bucket. And so I think that that's what's going on, right? That policymakers just want to expand. They want more to do, not less. So that's what I think is going on. Related to that, I do think that there is this relationship. We do need to think about the negative consequences. I think Elizabeth Hurd has one of the better treatments of this, about how there are some ways in which we can think about the negative consequences. That would be a different measurement, although I think I could, maybe think of a different paper that I could write and begin to track what those consequences would be. Related to that is what, about the handful of questions about what people actually think. When I wrote the paper, I was agnostic on it because part of it is just getting a sense of what do even people think about it. So even if you or I or any other respondents have a different definition in our mind, I didn't want to prime them by giving them a specific definition and get them to say no. Oftentimes it's just simply about, do they have a definition in their own mind about what it would include? There might be a way, if I go back and do this, about asking that question maybe towards the end. Here are some definitions. What do you think? And then I can begin to get at it more indirectly that way. But that's sort of the bigger question about the definition. And when you ask respondents, I don't want to shape their answers. Related to that, and finally on the GOP side, they do tend to be more supportive of international religious freedom. They are generally, and I'm forgetting the paper that I've seen on this, generally more supportive even for non-Christian faiths, because they tend to think about it as, if I'm supporting someone else's religious freedom, they're going to support mine. And so it tends to be this kind of tit for tat understanding. Although I think the center of gravity is that they tend to think about it more in respect to protecting Christians. So I think if I were to drill down, I would suspect that GOP respondents would think that these international religious freedom policy laws are going to support Christians overseas, not non-Christians. Even if maybe there's a kind of a heterogeneity in the actual responses, I bet the center of gravity is going to be a little bit closer to that. But somebody once described religious freedom as the gateway human right for Republicans. What brings them in. It might have been Alan Hertzke who said that to me, but or someone else. But it brings Republicans and conservatives into the human rights movement, and then they tend to realize that there are other things that are sort of related to that. But that's generally kind of been the big motivator.
Thanks. Do you want to give a quick response still, Niels?
No, I just wanted to say thank you, actually.
Okay, great.
Very clear answers. Very nice. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, well, regarding this definition matter of religious freedom, there are all kind of cross-references possible to, for example, Jonathan Fox's paper last week. So, but I was wondering, is there anyone else who wants to respond? And perhaps, because there is some thematic connection between Jason's paper last week, does Jason feel any urge to or drive to respond and to give some comments on the Luke's paper?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in. I was thinking about it this morning. Hi, Luke. Good to see you again. I think I was also thinking about this question about how the framing of the CES links to religious freedom. So the way I'm looking at it, it says foreign countries who oppress religious minorities, and just trying to tease out a little bit about whether people are thinking about that as religious discrimination, which John tends to look at in his books, and with the religion and state data set, versus discrimination of political, economic, or other types of discrimination against religious minorities. So it doesn't seem like the survey allows you to tease that out in this round, but if it's the latter, then it's sort of thinking about how it relates then to broader religious freedom. The other thing I was thinking about related to the work I presented is, are Democrats just less likely to think of religious freedom in these terms? Do they think of religious freedom in a broader sense of religious engagement with a variety of actors? So is it that perhaps not that Democrats are less supportive of international religious freedom, but just less supportive of this particular framing of it? And if you had framed it in a broader religious engagement, they would, the results would be slightly different. The last thing I'll add, just as I was invited, is to say, I think the definitions really matter. So there's a colleague of mine here at Notre Dame working with people at Chicago as well, who recently did a survey on US support, whether Americans see restrictions on access to places of worship as a restriction on religious freedom. And the survey actually finds that the majority of Americans do not, but they're very specific about by what they mean as religious freedom. So the definitions, matter here. And I really think this is a great paper because you're trying to tease that out with a survey that you didn't design, right? So I think you're doing a great job with what you have, and hopefully this is helpful. Okay,
thank you. Luke wants to have a short response, and then I see Christoph wants to give a response as well. But Luke first to have a short response to Jason, perhaps.
Yeah, Jason, you could probably expect an email from me pinging you for some of that extra information. You might be right in terms of Democrats and how they think about religious engagement. It's, you know, one of the things that the Obama administration did was downgrade the importance of the Office of International and Religious Freedom and stood up a new Office of Religious Engagement. I don't know the status of that. I've been trying to find out under the Trump administration, but one of the things that happened, I think, as a direct response to that in Congress was in the update to the Religious Freedom Act in 2016, which included atheism. They elevated the Office of Religious Freedom in the State Department to report directly to the State Department, so that the executive does no longer has the ability to lower that office, you know, beneath another office or another office. And so there's a kind of, you can kind of see clear kind of congressional intent. And the roll call on that, the roll call is the reporting of the voting in Congress. The roll call voting is something like, you know, 450 to 0. It's 98 to 0. I mean, it's overwhelming, and you never see those kinds of numbers. And so I think you might see some of the engagement side. Democrats tend to think of this in broader. They also tend to be more secular. And so they might just tend to think of, most of them get primed when they think about religious freedom. They also sometimes tend to think about it in terms of domestic politics. Like, okay, well, your religious freedom means that you don't want to support gay marriage, or you don't want to, you know, service these other peoples because of your religion. So they might actually be primed in a slightly different way. And I haven't yet thought through how to disentangle those. It might not be possible, but that's just something I'm thinking about. The last question, your very first question, is something I need to think about. And, you know, you can expect an email about how I might be able to do that on my second round.
Okay. Thank you. Christoph Sauer, you have a comment as well for Paris. The floor is yours. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Look, I very much appreciate such very focused research based, looking at one particular nation and based on empirical research. Now is just a comment for all. Just keep in mind that the readership of the journal where this will be published is an international readership. So my recommendation is that all the headings are very specific in that regard. So for example, your heading or headline or title, assessing public support for international religious freedom, then the subtitle could be evidence from the US in 2018. Okay, so you add which country you're actually focusing on. And the second comment, just to use this as an example, you have an acronym in your subtitle that is insider secrets that other people are not familiar with. So that is to be avoided in such a form. Then you have to spell it out, and then it might become too long, so you maybe just keep it to the text. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a good thing to keep in mind for all of us, that we are indeed in a very international context, global context actually. So that we have that in mind when we are making the final version of our paper. So thank you for that. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Jim Wallace has a question that has to be then the final question for this round. Jim?
Couple of quick comments. One, I appreciate you mentioning Hamburger's perspective on this. I think that's very important, and that book itself is very important work in addressing these questions. So I think that's important. Secondly, I think, and this came up in Jason's, the discussion about Jason's paper, the whole issue of religious freedom advocacy versus engagement in the offices in the US. I think sometimes that the International Religious Freedom Office has been unfairly characterized. I work very closely with them as being more on the advocacy side and not so much on the engagement side. Right now, the office stood up in the Obama administration, was rolled into the IRF office, and the people in the IRF office, the senior leaders there, see that as advancing the engagement that they had wanted to start. The second thing is by rolling it in the IRF office, it gave it statutory or legal protection. In its previous construction, it was only an office because the existing Secretary of State said it was an office. So that office's status would change whenever the Secretary of State changed. Now the whole engagement thing is protected by being in the IRF office by statutorily, and therefore it is currently expanding, and it's one of the areas that the office is most excited. So the Democrats are for engagement, Republicans are for advocacy. I don't know that that comparison always works.
Okay, thanks. Final response, Luke, and then we have to close off this round. Yeah.
Yeah, my only comment there is that last comment. Thank you, Jim. You know, there is a difference, I think, between Democrats and Republicans in the electorate when we poll them, and Democrats and Republicans, you know, in the executive office, in the State Department, or in elsewhere. Because when they're there, when they're in leadership offices, they're mainly concerned with, obviously, policymaking and trying to expand the scope of what they can actually do or get away with. And so I think you're right that by merging it in, I was not aware of it, by merging in engagement, everyone in the original IRF office is going to be excited. They're going to see that as related. I don't think if I asked people in those offices and then asked them their party AD, we probably would not see much difference. I suspect, however, if we were to ask just the broad set of voters out there, we would see differences. And that's, I think, where the real question is. And that's what I'm trying to suss out is, what do we think about voters or just general respondents? What are the levels of support for these policies?
That's a fair comment, and I would say if you want more on that, just send me a note.
Yeah, sure. I think if and if anyone else has some further comments or suggestions, just contact Luke directly with it. So great. Well, thank you, Luke, for presenting this, and well, we hope that it has been fruitful for you to work on the second version of the paper. Okay. Then we can continue with our next paper, which is by Marcello Bartolini, which is more a brief sketch still of the paper, the version that I have. But I can, well, I would like to give the floor to you to give some elucidation of what you are going to do. And so the floor is yours from Mexico, Marcello. Welcome. And
Thank you, Robert. Let me share PowerPoint. I'm not allowed to share.
Dennis, I think you have to give some
authorization.
Authorization, please. There. Yeah.
Done. Tell me if it works now.
Does it work now?
Okay, here we are.
Yeah, there it comes. Okay.
Thank you. Let me see. Okay, good afternoon, East Hemisphere. Good morning, West Hemisphere. My name is Marcelo Bartolini. I am a Mexican lawyer, and my affiliation is Article 18, which is a civil society organization whose purpose is the promotion and defense of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, mainly in my country. And before I begin, I would like to thank Professor Dennis Petrie for inviting me to participate in this expert seminar and give me the opportunity to restate the essay on a larger number of sheets to better explain some points. In order to understand the reason for this essay, I would have to start by telling you that the last year I had the opportunity to meet Professor Dennis Petrie on a trip he made to Mexico City. On that occasion, he wondered why, if the Mexican Constitution and international treaties protect religious freedom, do people get stuck when they want to apply it? And why, if there are several document cases filed in the Ministry of the Interior, does it not resolve them? In essence, what happens and what is needed to make this right more operational? To try to answer some of these questions, it's important for you to know the basic information about the historical context. of Mexico. In 1521, Spain conquered the territory called New Spain and imposed the Roman Catholic religion as the official religion. In 1861, as a consequence of Reformation War, the secular state was established, the separation of the state and the church, the nationalization of cemeteries and church properties, the establishment of civil marriage, and the breaking of diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Until 1992, the relationship between the State of Mexico and the Catholic Church was reestablished. The law of religious associations and public worship was created, and finally, the legal personality of religious association is recognized. Why this research is relevant? According to the National Survey on Discrimination, 2017, prepared by the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, together with other public institutions, the most frequent reasons for discriminations are appearance, religious beliefs, and gender for women, while for men it's appearance, manner of speaking, and age, as shown in this graphic, where religious beliefs are in second place. Another good reason could be that Mexico has become the most dangerous country in Latin America to be a priest for the 9th consecutive year. From 1990 to 2017, the list of homicides includes 1 cardinal, 45 priests, 1 deacon, 4 religious, 9 lay people, and 1 Catholic reporter. 2 cases of iconic attacks stand out, one against the Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City, and the other against the office of the Mexican Bishops' Conference. Key findings. To solve the initial questions, the regulatory framework that determines the content and scope of religious freedom in Mexico was reviewed. The regulatory framework is integrated as follows: Federal Constitution, several international treaties, the law of religious associations, public worship, and the regulation of the referred law. The first conclusion is that there is a sufficient, although restrictive, regulatory framework that protects religious freedom in Mexico. Subsequently, it was investigated whether there is currently a public policy on religious freedom in Mexico. To this end, the organic law of the Federal Public Administration and the internal regulations of the responsible authority were reviewed. The National Development Plan was consulted, and 3 rounds of requests for access to public information were made through the National Platform for Transparency on the Internet. The second conclusion is that no federal public policy of religious freedom was found in Mexico. What was found is that the authority in charge of guaranteeing the secular character of the Mexican state conducting relations between the state and the churches, as well as applying the law of religious associations and public worship, is the Ministry of the Interior. And the responsible unit of the Ministry of the Interior that is in charge of the budget program PO18 called Conduct of Federal Government Policy in Religious Matters is the General Director of Religious Affairs. However, the public services offered by the responsible unit on this website refer to 9 administrative procedures, which have as their purpose the control and surveillance of religious associations and ministers of worship in the country. Another relevant aspect that was found is that the organic law of the Federal Public Administration, which indicates who does what, and the law of religious associations and public worship were published before the change of constitutional paradigm regarding human rights in 2011, and they have not been updated in that subject. Therefore, they don't incorporate the obligation to promote, protect, and guarantee the human rights, freedom of religion included, and there is no public authority designated to do so. For this reason, the unit responsible within the Ministry of the Interior continues to have a vision that is limited to controlling and monitoring religious associations and ministers of worship, and complaints or claims against actions of public authorities and individuals which violate the human right to freedom of religion have had to seek other avenues to be addressed, such as the National Human Rights Commission, Ombudsman, and the National Council for the Prevention of Discrimination. The National Human Rights Commission states that it doesn't have an exclusive program on the subject of interest. Its main contributions have been General Recommendation number 5, which calls on the governors of the states and Federal Secretary of Public Education to issue instructions to the educational authorities to refrain from penalizing students who, because of their beliefs, refuse to honor the flag and sing the national anthem at civic ceremonies held in schools. Also, the booklet entitled The Human Right to Religious Freedom for publications, one didactic capsule for internet, and the registration of 9 complaint files for violation of the right of religious freedom from January 2013 to date. National Council to Prevent Discrimination state that its actions are framed in the budget program PO24 called Promote the Protection of Human Rights and Prevent Discrimination, and the National Program for Equality and Non-Discrimination, PRONAIN, the latter in the process of updating. The main contributions have been the participation or organization of various spaces for dialogue with different religious associations, the participation in the design and dissemination of the National Survey on Discrimination, ENADIS 2017, which includes discrimination based on religion and state above, the creation of a specialized internet platform called National Information System on Discrimination, SINDIS, 10 publications, a story for kids titled Free School with F for Fire, which is part of Kipatla collection, and the registration of 66 complaints and claims for acts of discrimination related to religious beliefs from 2013 to date, of which 60 files are concluded. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, for this kind of update and overview of the Mexican context that you have given us. I think we have asked Thomas, Matthew, or Frans to give a response, so I don't know who is going to take the floor. Thomas, I see you
yes,
there. Yes, okay, the floor is yours.
Yes, it will be Thomas. So first of all, Marcelo, thank you so much for this contribution. I think it's very fruitful, and it's a deep insight into one country. When I was reading the outline, I thought maybe it is even interesting for many other countries. Maybe one could make a book out of many countries, so like a handbook or something like that. But this is maybe for another day. Just allow me, let's say, 4 quick remarks. And the first one, I already apologies beforehand. These are just my lawyer's genes. In your first part, where you give the framework, the outline, I would recommend to structure it in that way that you start with the international human rights, then come regional human rights, and then come the national laws, and maybe there are even subnational laws relevant for it. But so just that the reader can follow an order much easier than it is now. The second one is maybe not all readers are familiar with the concept of public policy on freedom of religion and belief. So if there is one country, ideally in your region, where you know there is such public policy, then just maybe give a link in your presentation so that the reader can say, can see, oh yeah, this is a positive example. Or if you have space in your article, maybe even give a very brief explanation. This is what country X has done, and this is how it worked out. Because you're saying Mexico doesn't have it, so what is the positive example? Then 2 remarks from more on the substance. One is, and I'm not an expert on Mexico by no means, but reading our country profile, I have read that the Interior Ministry announced drafting a national strategy for the promotion of respect and tolerance for religious diversity. and I couldn't find it in the paper. So maybe you have it all already in your documents, but I didn't see it in this outline. So maybe you can follow up. What is it? Is it still actual, or is it inzwischen? Is it meanwhile has it died? And the second one is, and this is really something I was missing a bit. I think in Mexico, but also in other countries, especially in Latin America, like in Colombia, we have this situation where indigenous people have a certain kind of autonomy. It is even granted by the constitution. And we find in our work that people who convert from the traditional religion in these indigenous groups, be it to Christianity, be it to whatever, they bear the brunt of problems. They are in troubles with their family, they are in troubles with the community, they are in trouble everywhere. And the problem is, because of the autonomy, no one is interested in it. So the national authorities say, oh yeah, but there is autonomy, so we cannot intervene, we cannot do anything. The communities have the right, even the constitutional right, basically to do whatever they want. So the individual rights of the individual believer are kind of waived, neglected. So my question would be, and so far I didn't find a good monography on this, because it cannot be. I mean, of course, in theory, they still have their human rights, but how does it actually look in practice? So this may be much broader, or this is much broader than you can outline it in the paper. But at least I would mention it because this is one of the aspects of freedom of religion, which seems to be important in Mexico, according to our findings.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. It may be, I get a note that Dennis wants to give a comment too, and it may be related to this final point. I don't know. If so, perhaps Dennis, then you can perhaps add immediately now your point, and then I give the floor back to Marcelo to respond.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Govert. Well, yeah, I wasn't going to speak to this specifically, but yes, there are many different phases of religious freedom violations in Mexico. One is, of course, the anti-religious tradition of the Mexican state, which, by the way, is really extreme. When you compare this with other countries. Actually, the data from the Religion and State Project by Jonathan Fox bears this out. So there's one point there, but there's other dimensions as well, as Thomas rightly stated. So there's the issues in indigenous communities. There's also the issues connected to organized crime that I've researched myself quite extensively. So there's many other dimensions of religious freedom violations. And I think when you look at policy, I just would like to respond to this, is that I'm concerned, and it's a similar concern that was raised in the questions that were asked to Luc Perez as well, is, well, what do not only people, but what do policymakers understand by religious freedom? And do they really cover all these different dimensions in their policy, if there is any policy, right? But I think in Mexico, we need to go back a couple of steps. I think the starting point really is that there needs to be serious documentations of incidents of religious freedom violations. And I think that will be the starting point for religious freedom policy. If you don't do that, then you've got nothing. In addition to that, I think, and this was raised also last week, we need to really promote religious literacy and also religious freedom literacy. So understand all those dimensions of religious freedom and how to first document them and then respond to them. And of course, if you don't have if policymakers don't have a basic level of religious literacy and have an anti-religious bias, because that's really what happens in Mexico, then of course what you see, and that's what I've also encountered many times myself, is that many incidents are simply not qualified as religious freedom violations. They're just being categorized as non-religious, so political or cultural or ethnic or whatever. And the consequence is that they are not being addressed, and that's a major issue. So I'll leave it here. Of course, there's much more I could say. Mexico is of course a country that's very dear to me, but in any case, thank you for your presentations, and I hope my comments can be useful to you.
Okay, Marcelo, you have you have a lot on your plate now, so perhaps you can respond with just pick your main concerns, perhaps.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate your comments and obviously all what you have said about it. To express all the ideas in 750 words is challenging, so I appreciate the opportunity to extend for more larger number of sheets for explain this. Obviously, it's the first approach for the problem, and what we are looking is an authority which is interested in control, surveillance, and governance. I mean, they are not looking for promotion and the respect and the protection of the human rights in specific for religious freedom. So what I found is two alternatives for we address these claims, and one is the ombudsman, national ombudsman, and the other the Council for Discrimination. And what Dennis was talking about was the documentation of violations. I totally agree, but we can do that if we don't know where are they. I mean, we need to start to find which authorities are trying to make some solutions for these problems. So these first clues maybe let us the opportunity to make this documentation and maybe push for avoid this neglect attitude from authorities. And obviously, I'll take in consideration all what you have said for the second round of my essay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcelo. I don't know whether there are other responders, and if so, you can perhaps use other channels as well to give further suggestions. Thank you very much for this very interesting insight into the Mexican context. So thank you. We can now continue to our next paper, which will be presented by John Feli Osorio Cardona about the urban setting for interreligious dialogue. So in Manizales. So the floor is yours. Can you? Yeah, there you go. Yes, yeah. Okay, yes. Well, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. It is an honor for me to participate in the seminar, The Impact of Religious Freedom Research. I am civil engineer. I have a master in urbanism and other master in theology. Next, I will present the research titled Interreligious Dialogue, Participatory Mechanism in the Urban Planning of Places of Worship in Manizales. Manizales is a city of 400,000 inhabitants located in the center of Colombia, founded in 1849. In the city, there is a great religious pluralism. There are 116 places of worship of various denominations, Buddhist, Christian, Orthodox, Hindu, among others. Our research seeks to respond to a world situation. Urban planning does not take religious confessions into account for decision making. If the urban planning is the technical, environmental, economic, and social mechanism to order the territory, we could say that in urban planning there is no social mechanism to plan about places of worship. Therefore, decision may violate the freedom to establish and carry out the worship. For example, urban planning can determine that places of worship can only be located in peripheral areas of a city or in areas where there are no access roads or where there is no public transportation. In Manizales, we built the Interreligious Dialogue for Urbanism, Team Endure. It was established since 2017 and is made up of the religious leaders of the different confessions present in the city. It was structured thanks to the support of Sociology, who provides us with a method called participatory action research, and which allows us to carry out various techniques to collect information, such as focus groups, interviews, surveys, social cartography, among others, to know the understandings that religious confessions have about the place of worship into the urban space. It was also structured thanks to theology, which allows us reflections on how to establish a dialogue between such different confessions. The Endure team has had many achievements. Achieved to include line 4 in the public policy or religious freedom of Manizales, called Inclusion of Freedom of Worship in Urban Planning, which has actions such as carry out a safety diagram of places of worship and carry out a road safety plan to protect believers from the risk of traffic accidents, between others actions. The Endure team also participated in the formulation of the city's land use plan and discovered a restriction that declared that places of worship would have to be located more than 50 meters from games of chance or gambling places. The green areas on this map show the only areas available where places of worship could be located according to this restriction. The team achieved to remove this restriction. Results and conclusions. There can be many violations of religious freedom in urban space because urban planning does not have mechanism such as the Endure team. We find in this research that most of the confessions are located in the urban space according to confessional criteria. There is a characteristic of their religion. For example, the Church of God Ministry of Jesus Christ International has the promise of the Holy Spirit to preach in all areas of the planet. So it is of great interest for this confession to be able to locate its place of worship in any area of urban space. Hare Krishna community, for their part, seek to locate their place of worship exclusively in vulnerable areas because they believe that poor people are the ones God will help. Catholics located their main place of worship in the center of the city because they think that God is at the center of everything. Therefore, from this research, we observe that if urban planning makes decisions without taking into account the religious beliefs, then can violate religious freedom through this urbanistic decision. we also find that the action of the place of worship is not only spiritual, but also social. From the place, for example, it helps the recovery of drug addicts. Some places help resolve conflicts between gang members in the sector. In most places, they teach to love people and to respect governments. Then they help build social fabric and citizenship. With this, it could be concluded that it would be beneficial for urban planning to promote the location of places of worship in conflict zones in the city, in accordance with the social and educational service they provide. The team relate different topics and problems with the worship freedom, like insecurity, vandalism, risk of landslides and fires, among other situations. So the injured team monitors the state protections of places of worship year after year. Finally, it is concluded that the injured team is a necessary participatory mechanism, not only for Manizales, but also for multi-confessional territories, in order to guarantee respect for freedom of worship in the territory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this very interesting example of what you mentioned, action research or action participatory research, which gives perhaps a model that we can be learned from in very different contexts as well. So thank you for that. Christoph, you were asked to give a brief response, so perhaps you have some further observations on this. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, John, for your fascinating paper. And it reminds me that the issue of urban planning is located in a broader framework of living together. And in other countries, there are conflicts about this. For example, in Rwanda, many churches have been closed under the guise of hygiene regulations or building safety, etc., etc. But obviously, it is fully acceptable that you focus specifically on the urban planning aspect. But obviously, it is embedded in a wider framework. Once the things are built, how can they be maintained, and how can civil order and peace be maintained? Or the whole issue of noise nuisance, for example. Okay. So that's just about the broad embedding. Then just on the one-page text that you have given us, which I had for preparation, you say the software was designed to measure and evaluate 13 indicators. That's very good. You have precise indicators. Obviously, we are very keen to know which are these 13 indicators. And it seems in your PowerPoint, you have given us a few samples of such indicators. So I would expect in your paper, obviously, that we will be able to see all 13 indicators, maybe in a table, or you might even discuss them. Then obviously this, I now just simply call it roundtable, is something very commendable. You make, and very fruitful and productive. You make the statement, it can be said that this table is unique in the world. I just made a note on the side, careful, exclamation mark. How did you research this to be able to make such a statement with confidence? So you might just be slightly more modest in your choice of words, and then you don't run into trouble if somebody else finds one. You could say, I couldn't find one. Then it's a subjective statement and very acceptable. And then about terminology. Obviously, we have a challenge of different languages used, and I assume you usually operate in Spanish, and now you have to present in English and write in English. You use several times, you use the term freedom of worship, or sometimes you say worship freedom. Now, I just made a note asking, why did you use this term? Because in the United States, the term freedom of worship was used in a way to reduce this broad concept of freedom of religion or belief, to reduce it only to the aspect of public worship. So I would recommend that you be very careful in the choice of your terminology throughout your paper, that it says exactly what you want. Because yes, you might want to talk about freedom of worship and assembly for worship and building places and spaces of worship in the context of urban planning. But in other contexts, you might want to talk about freedom of religion or belief as the broad framework in which your paper operates. So careful about precise terminology. Again, at the bottom of your paper, you talk about violating the human right to religious freedom and worship. Oh, that's a quote. But anyway, I again found ambiguous use of terminology. Maybe I should stop there. I've spent my 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Christoph. Perhaps you have a response, John? Yeah.
Yes, I will respond in Spanish. The professor Dennis Petri will help us to translate it. Es correcto, tendré en cuenta tus recomendaciones. Verdaderamente, pues debo utilizar mejor la terminología. Con respecto a los indicadores, pues digamos que es una propuesta nuestra que surge a partir de la propia mesa Endure, porque ella ayuda a detectar algunas cosas que no se permiten detectar u observar desde el gobierno. Por ejemplo, para ellos es importante señalizar los lugares de culto. Primero, porque hay alto riesgo de accidentalidad por la gran cantidad de personas que acuden allí. Segundo, porque algunas de las entidades minoritarias o de las confesiones que tienen lugares de culto de poca afluencia se sienten un poco discriminados porque en la ciudad o en nuestro país les dicen iglesias de garaje y eso para ellos es algo despectivo. Por lo tanto, algo tan sencillo como esta acción de la señalización es algo que hay que medir en nuestro municipio. Otro factor importante es, por ejemplo, la seguridad, ya que nos encontramos con una confesión religiosa que tenía en un inicio 100 creyentes, pero después el sector se volvió inseguro, se transformó inseguro y por ello en términos de un año pasó de tener 100 creyentes a 50 creyentes porque las personas ya no acudían al lugar de culto. Esto significa que la seguridad tiene que ver también con la libertad de religión o con la libertad de culto. Otro punto importante es el riesgo, gestión de riesgo, porque en Manizales algunos lugares de culto se encuentran en alta montaña, porque estamos sobre la cordillera de los Andes, y nuestro país debe garantizar una libertad de cultos de manera que proteja también a los lugares de culto de que no se vayan a deslizar, porque eso impediría que se realice el culto. Y en Manizales aconteció en 2017 con una confesión religiosa, la cual tuvo que ser evacuada por esta misma razón y se quedó durante 3 meses sin un lugar para generar el culto. Denis.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Gracias. That's where I can get in Spanish. I think that stopped for me. But muchas gracias. Thank you very much for this. Are there other people who like to comment, or otherwise we are going to continue.
So should I quickly translate?
Perhaps you can just
for
give
those
a
who don't speak
brief
Spanish.
summary. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It doesn't summarize. So John Christoph, thanks you for your comments on the terminology. He will review that of freedom of worship, freedom of religion, and on the indicators. Well, basically, what he mentioned is that these indicators came forward as proposals that were discussed in this round table of citizens, and they referred actually to aspects that the city government had not been considering. And so you mentioned 3 examples. One is the importance of road signs to highlight places of worship for to avoid traffic accidents, and also to properly refer to churches and other religious groups that gather in garages, for example, and really give them a proper sign that's respectful of them being a religious institution. Second point is the issue of security that actually affected freedom, access to places of worship in some areas. And the third indicator is risk management that's related to the issue of also access to places of worship high up in the mountains and protect those areas from landslides. So this is just a quick summary. I would just like to add for the record how unique, even though Christoph, you said you must be very careful saying something is unique, but I wanted to say it myself as an external observer, how unique this public policy is in Manizales. It's really the first time that I encounter at a municipal level that there really is a public policy to promote religious freedom that takes into account overlooked elements that are brought forward by the citizenship, that also looks at the intersection between religious freedom and urban planning, for example, which is something you don't usually think about. And so it's also a very good model to prevent religious conflicts, at least in theory. I don't know how well that works in practice, but yeah, I just would like to stress how unique this initiative is. Yeah, back to you, Govert.
Thank you, Dennis, for this brief translation, which is just very helpful. And about the uniqueness, I think even in the Netherlands we had with city planners that they had totally overlooked the idea of churches because they had the idea, this is religion is something of the distant past, and then all of a sudden the churches came forward. And so even in the Netherlands it might be a problem to include in urban planning this point. So it may be well that we can learn from Manizales in this respect. So thank you very much. If there are other comments, I'm sure you all can find John and give further comments. And we're looking forward to your full paper, John. This is really interesting. Thank you. We have to continue. There's actually with Dennis' own paper on the human security approach to religious freedom. On this vulnerability assessment tool. And I may remind you all that Dennis is going to defend his dissertation on this upcoming Friday. I think that it's a public event, perhaps, so we can perhaps send a link as well to all people there. The time may not be as nice for everybody as this one, so I think in Costa Rica, where you live, it will be during 1 o'clock in the night or something like that, Dennis. So you will have a tough night there. So you can perhaps join here. So Dennis, I give the floor to you to present your paper.
Yes, well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my paper, A Human Security Approach to Religious Freedom, the Religious Minorities Vulnerability Assessment Tool. And actually, just to give you some context, the starting point for my research was my disappointment, my insatisfaction with existing tools to assess religious freedom that actually did not sufficiently, to my taste, describe religious freedom violations that I encountered while doing fieldwork in different Latin American countries. But let me first give a very brief overview of the origins of religious freedom assessment tools. So they were first started by faith-based organizations as a kind of internal planning tool or an intelligence instrument, if you will. Then civil society organizations started to take religious freedom into account in their monitoring instruments. Eventually public and multilateral institutions started to take religious freedom into consideration, or the monitoring of religious freedom. And of course, a very important example is the International Religious Freedom Act in the United States that really led to the development of some important monitoring instruments of religious freedom. And then eventually it also became part of a number of academic research projects, first as through the inclusion of religious freedom as a variable in general data sets. That was not a very sophisticated treatment of religious freedom. And then pure religious freedom assessment tools started to emerge. I distinguish between sociometric tools, which include the very much frequently quoted tools by the Pew Research Center, but also the Religion and State project by Jonathan Fox that was presented during this seminar last week. And then there are tools that are expert opinion based, like the World Watch List of Open Doors, which focuses exclusively on Christians. That was also presented during this expert seminar. And so I wanted to give a very brief review of these academic tools. And well, the primary benefit of these tools is that they make religious freedom visible through their documentation, quantification, and the possibility to compare the situation of religious freedom worldwide. And that is actually quite significant because it has really informed a lot of research in academia, but also has had a substantial impact on policy, including foreign policy. But nevertheless, there are a couple of shortcomings. And here I want to be very clear, and I don't want any misunderstanding. I'm not saying that these tools are useless. On the contrary, I use them myself, and I think they are very beneficial. But I did find a couple of shortcomings in view of the reality, the empirical reality that I encountered in my fieldwork in Latin America. And well, for a number of reasons, these tools are not totally equipped to observe these particular realities. And I can give some examples later, but in general, I find that they are insufficiently holistic, and that is because their starting point is a predefined set of variables or questionnaire, and so they don't look at things that are not part of their predefined list of things that they're looking for. They tend to neglect the local scale. Of course, there are important exceptions. They do take local variations into account, but in general, they are national tools and compare tools at the national level. They do tend to have a state bias, again with exceptions, but they generally look at persecution coming from the state and not at persecution coming from non-state actors, such as in Latin America, organized crime or indigenous leaders or actors like that. And they have quite a restrictive definition of religion. I'll come back to that in a minute, and also of persecution. And the problem with actually the use of persecution, in my view, is twofold. First is that everyone has a different understanding about what persecution is. And second, when persecution is defined, it's defined in a way that is way too narrow to my taste. So that's why I turned to the field of human security as an alternative framework to observe the vulnerability of religious minorities. So this was introduced in 1994 by the UNDP Human Development Report, and can be defined as the protection of the vital core of all human lives from critical and pervasive threats. And so human security is essentially a new way to consider security in conflict, shifting away from the state as referent of security, which allows to look at the role of non-state actors, and also at dynamics that occur at subnational level. And please mute your microphones, please. And it's also human security also introduces a shift towards the subjects of security, which would be the victims of human security violations. So I think that's a very very important point. And so I found that this was actually quite a usable framework to assess the vulnerability of...
Mute your microphones if you are not talking. Mute your microphones, please. Someone has, yes? Okay. Yes, please go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah. So I just want to say this is a very usable framework to assess the vulnerability of religious minorities. And so, as requirements of a new tool, I formulated the following. Let me see if I can mute myself. Mute all. there you go. Okay. So the requirements I formulated for the new tool, well, one is that it has to be sufficiently open-ended, so to take into consideration overlooked elements, religious freedom violations, has to take the local scale into account, take the role of non-state actors into consideration, and focus on the minorities suffering the human rights abuses. So these 4 aspects are covered by the human security perspective, but there are 2 more elements that I would like to highlight. First, the need to adopt a broad definition of religion, and the need to acknowledge the multidimensional nature of religious freedom. And so this is the definition of religion that I adopt as a belief system that inspires or influences the individual and collective behavior of its adherent. And to operationalize this, and I'm going very quickly just because of time, I've determined this continuum of religious identity and behavior that allows to compare religious identity or religious self-identification and different forms of active participation, active religious behavior. And well, my concern with most of the existing tools is they primarily look at religious identity and some forms of religious participation, but really the more active forms of religious behavior are a blind spot on these tools. And it turns out in Latin America that in general, as a general rule, and there are exceptions, but in general, the more active the religious behavior, the higher the vulnerability of religious minorities. And this is also a way to define religious minorities. So to finish, this is the tool essentially that I use to assess human security threats, and I inventory those threats and I compare them, or I categorize them by using this continuum of religious identity and behavior, and I categorize them by sphere of society. So just to finish, this is just one of the elements of the religious minorities vulnerability assessment tool that I developed, but there are 2 more elements to that tool, the specificity assessment and the resilience assessment. I've applied this in my PhD dissertation to 3 Latin American cases, which I invite you to read. And this is, I think, very important. My tool is a complement to existing religious freedom assessment tools that sheds light on understudied, overlooked religious freedom violations. So it's a complement, not a substitute. I think that's important. Also because my tool to execute this, to implement it, is very time consuming. So it's not fit for cross-national comparison. It really requires a lot of field work, but it does allow to cast the net wider than existing tools do. I think that's the primary benefit of my approach. Okay.
Thank you, Dennis, for this presentation of your main approach that you have been developing over the last years. Janet, I think I would like to invite you to give some comments to Dennis. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Vrije, and thank you very much, Dennis, for this very interesting paper. And full disclosure, I am a country expert on the World Watch List, so that is the tool that I'm most familiar with. And it's always helpful to see some critiques on the limitations of existing tools. And I, for one, always welcome more and better tools to assess religious freedom worldwide. I certainly take the point on the laundry list, and you make the point in your paper of surveys that miss out potential threats from drug cartels in Latin America, and if that is missing, that is very significant. I also note that I remember back prior to the war on Kosovo, we were hearing from religious minorities that there was a huge and brewing issue, and that this would erupt in military conflict, and this was largely ignored. by other countries, but it is interesting that that was one conflict that was identified by religious communities, I think, first. And so this type of tool, I think, would be very helpful for identifying in particular, and countries should take note of this for that reason, that that this can be an early warning system for potential conflict. So I appreciate the fact that you talk about this being complementary to existing tools. And I guess my only question would be how you would see this being used. Like, is this a situation where an existing tool might show a flag? Because I do note that the World Watch List does include some of these other, it certainly includes family conflict. I believe it includes other kinds of conflict and threats to religious freedom beyond just state conflict. And so would you use this tool kind of in specific locations where it's already been flagged by one of the general surveys? Or how would you see it being most useful? Or would it need to have some questions inserted into some of the existing tools to sort of show where this tool now needs to be used?
Okay, thank you. Dennis, you would like to give a response?
Yes, well, Janet, thank you very much for your kind comments. And I certainly appreciate what you say, that this could be helpful as an early warning tool to identify and prevent potential conflicts. I think we can all benefit from getting a broader view, and that's what my tool is useful for. But regarding your specific question on how this could inspire existing tools, well, this can be done at different levels. First of all, of course, when you look at the, let me just make a general comment. First of all, I really would like to encourage existing tools, and whether those are questionnaires or data sets or other narrative tools, to really take into consideration these aspects, dynamics that occur at the subnational level. I think that's very important. Take into consideration the role of non-state actors, and take into consideration also the consequences of religious behavior, and not only religious identity. I think that is just key. But then, of course, all these findings can, of course, inform all those laundry lists. They could be complemented, additional questions could be created, etc. And I think that would be very beneficial. But you mentioned specifically the World Watch List, and what's interesting is that the World Watch List is actually a very flexible tool, and so my research and others who may also use my tool, those reports can be used directly as input for the World Watch List, and can inform additional or can provide additional qualitative input for it. So there's different ways in which my tool can really contribute to other tools. Yeah. But maybe just as a final comment, the most important thing is that really religious freedom violations are taken into consideration in as broad as possible. That's why I'm personally not convinced about the use of the concept of persecution. We really need to take into consideration all the dimensions of religious freedom, and we also need to take into consideration those threats that might just be discarded on the basis that they're not specifically related to religion, because they could be, right? It's like in John's example on Colombia, you would say, well, what's urban planning got to do with religion? Well, you see, there are a couple of aspects that the city government had ignored, right? So if you beforehand, based on a preconceived notion, decide, well, this is not persecution, this is not specifically related to religion, then there's really so much that you miss. So I really would like this mindset to evolve.
Thank you, Dennis. Are there other comments that people want to make? In the chat, I don't see specific requests for this. Others, no. Well, if you have further comments, of course, then you can contact Dennis. And you all have his mail address. So thank you very much, both Dennis and Janet, for this. Very interesting. Oh, yeah, there is a question. Oh, I see Jason. Jason, yes. Yeah. Well, then the floor is yours. Yeah.
Okay, if we have a minute, otherwise I can send it. But just quick question, Dennis. Really fascinating stuff, and I'm really interested in the variety of critiques and gaps that you sort of fill with this tool. Just one quick question. I'd love to hear more either now or in another conversation about these different spheres of society that you demarcate, and just sort of how you think about them being independent or overlapping. So I imagine it could vary by context. For example, in some places like the US, the healthcare system is the business sphere, and I wouldn't see it as distinct from the social sphere. So I'm just curious how you're thinking about that and how that plays out. Thanks again. This can be a great tool for all of us.
Thank you for your question, Jason. Well, actually, the most important thing to remember is to consider that religious freedom is something that is expressed in different spheres of society. So, for example, you cannot restrict religious freedom just to freedom of worship or individual forms of worship or collective forms of worship. There is religious expression in different spheres of society. I think that's an important starting point. And then, yes, those spheres may definitely overlap depending on culture, context, etc. But that's not what's relevant. What's important, I think, is that you go and look at each of these spheres and make sure you consider any possible restrictions on religious expression that may occur in these spheres. So, well, so if you encounter a restriction on religious expression in the health sphere, then you also find it in the business sphere. It doesn't matter. The thing is that you take it into consideration. It's like a memory aid, so to speak, to make sure that you don't miss out on overlooked dimensions of religious freedom.
Okay. Thanks again. Yes, we have to leave it here for this part of the session, because we have to move on to our final presentation, which is going to be given by Christoph. It has not been a full paper yet, but you have prepared a presentation, and Luke is going to respond to that. So, Christoph, then the floor is yours. Again, you open the session, so you may close it as well in a way. So yes, there you go. Please unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Yes. And Dennis has to unmute his total lockdown of all, I guess.
Well, I think Christoph is sharing his screen now.
Yes, but no, there's no. But still, his microphone is on mute. So perhaps.
Okay, now.
Yes, there you go. Yes, there you go. Yeah, okay.
Apologies for the technical hiccup. I'm almost set up now. Okay, here we start. Yes, so first apologies that I did not submit a draft paper. I have just recently moved from one continent to another, and I'm still in crisis managing mode. Okay, so the topic is how many Christians are under threat of persecution, assessing various approaches. And as you might be aware, I'm affiliated with different institutions. So I'm at a theological college in Germany, and also linked as a professor in Leuven in Belgium, and the institute I presented to you already. The research question is more precisely, how many Christians are globally under actual threat of persecution, so currently and globally? And there are three sub-questions. What published research is available that could help to get closer to an answer? How do the approaches and outcomes differ? And third, how meaningful and useful are the outcomes of the research available? And a caveat, this is my research question, And the primary intention of the sources examined might not focus on exactly the same question. Now, as we talked about a definition of terms, Christians understand very broadly. Persecution I also understand very broadly. And threat of persecution means that people might not actually and currently be persecuted, but they live in a context that makes it highly likely that they will experience it sooner or later. And yes, now and worldwide is the focus. Obviously, one could ask the same question, how many Christians are affected by restrictions of freedom of religion or belief? And that would not exactly be the same questions, because the concept of persecution and the concept of freedom of religion or belief, they overlap, or the violations of, but they're not exactly the same. Each of those has a part that is not covered by the other. And also, whether you speak of restrictions of religious freedom or violations of religious freedoms, it's also two pairs of shoes. So I deliberately chose to use the term persecution, and maybe it has to do with the sources that are available to answer the question. 3 sources that are used: Pew, Todd Johnson, Open Doors. And I'm taking 4 steps when looking at each of the sources. So the first is the Pew Research Center, a closer look at how religious restrictions have risen around the world. And there, very late on 4 pages, they raise a question, which I now formulate: in how many countries was harassment against Christians, either by governments or individuals and groups in society, reported in 2017? And the outcome to that question is in 143 countries out of 187, and among 198 assessed. And I skip the analysis in all cases and go straight to the assessment. And here I focus more on the critical aspects. So this report is the only one among the 3 that assesses all countries. It does not assess the severity of harassment. Another point, it assesses harassment of religious groups in general in a country. But even if that harassment in general is high, it might be for any religious group, but Christians might not be necessarily affected, even though they live in that country. Then actually the mention or the counting of that country is not appropriate. And finally, the number of countries in itself has little meaning due to vastly divergent population sizes. So bottom line, the result is not very satisfying for my research question. And remember, it was a marginal side issue in the Pew report. It was not their central question. Okay, the next one is a very long essay by Todd Johnson, which was commissioned for this book. And he looks at persecution in the context of religious and Christian demography. And his research question is, how many Christians lived under threat of persecution in the 46 countries identified by Marshall with the most significant threat, or where there are more egregious cases? The outcome for 2010, 500 million Christians. In 2020, the projection says 600 million Christians live in those 46 countries that were identified. If we go to the assessments, the number of Christians resident in a country does not always equal the number of Christians under threat of persecution, which means then this number gives an overcount of the real situation. And then in this research, persecution is limited to the most egregious. And considering countries with lesser degrees of persecution in addition would obviously increase the total of Christians then affected by that. And the figures for 2020 are projection made already in 2013. So the countries selected, those 46 in 2012, might have shifted in 2020, and their number might also have increased. And the third case is the Open Doors World Watch list, which has already been presented. And in there is a section talking about the total number of persecuted Christians. And the research questions, and it's always me basically framing this research question, trying to show what they have looked at. How many Christians are affected by extreme, very high, or high level of persecution in the countries of the World Watch list when assessing the proportion of Christians affected on a country-by-country level. And the outcomes are at least 260 million Christians in the top 50 countries. This is what is publicly presented, and the small print says 320 million in all 73 countries that meet the persecution threshold. Sorry, why does it not go forwards? Okay, these are the categories or the scale that Open Doors uses. And we jump to the assessments. I start at the third bullet point. Reaching the threshold of persecution is disproportionately influenced by sectors of Christianity, namely converts and non-traditional Christians, that are in many cases numerically smaller than other sectors of Christianity in the country. Thus, it would need to be assessed whether this is the case in countries scoring high levels of persecution and whether this is reflected in the estimate of Christians affected. So this is something I have to pursue further. Another point, the communication of the outcomes is in the straitjacket of agency policy focusing on the top 50 countries. And bottom line, a certain level of uncertainty remains. And an open question to the authors, is there any detailed documentation accessible how the number of Christians affected region by region in a country is determined, including the rationale for the assessment in each individual case? And this is just to show you where I want to go with further steps. I want to compare the approaches, and all the factors listed here have a direct influence on the outcomes. And in the end, the main question is the meaningfulness of the outcomes. And then I want to interpret in the larger framework. 3 points, 4 points. Global outcomes are largely influenced by estimates of Christian demographics in China. Then if there's uncertainty about those, this will directly affect the level of certainty about the number of Christians under threat of persecution. So my answer currently, probably it is most prudent to answer the research question with a range between a likely minimum and an absolute maximum. And in presenting such numbers, it is very important to embed the numbers into global Christian and religious demographics. And there are further interesting questions that have arisen from those various sources and which are dealt with in some of them: historical, geographical, distinction between different groups of Christianity and comparison with other religions. And the open question I have to you, and with this I close, did I overlook any high quality sources that could directly contribute to a substantiated answer to the research question? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Christoph, for this very interesting presentation. the paper that you are going to write, which is almost a larger project even than a paper, I guess. But Luke, I don't know whether you had now heard it for the first time or whether you had an opportunity to have a short preview of this already. But the floor is yours anyway to give a short response.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Christoph, for this very interesting paper. I think it's quite interesting to think about why really basic research questions like this have not yet been answered, right? We don't really have good estimates of what really these numbers sort of look like. The questions that I have, I think, begin with what, my, mentors used to always ask me is, the so what question, right? What do we really gain, however, by having these accurate numbers? I mean, wouldn't it be better just to know which countries are engaging in persecution or discrimination in any which way? Like, what's the analytical or the research advantage by knowing what those numbers actually are? You mentioned this, a second question, in your further steps, but I was wondering about the three sources and what kinds of variances we're going to get from their methodology. So if they're using different measurement estimations, then, we're going to get some noise in there somehow. And maybe that's why you're suggesting there's a likely minimum and an absolute maximum. But I think that, if that range is extremely wide, then, it's like saying, well, we know there's more than one, but, less than 7 billion. I don't think it's obviously going to be that big, but how wide do we expect this range to be? And what are the ways in which you think we can narrow it in to get that range to be much more accurate to what we want? And then finally, I like that you mentioned you're focusing on those who are under actual threat, but I'm wondering if, especially because we do think about this relationship or this gradient between different levels of persecution, there's sort of a hard persecution and a soft. There's probably a number of people that are under a perceived threat. They might actually believe they're under threat of persecution, even if persecution isn't there. And relatedly, there are people I think who are under actual threat who might not even know that they're under that actual threat. And so, I'm wondering how you plan on maybe trying to sort of delineate those other sort of variables.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke, for these insightful questions. Christoph, you want to give a brief response?
Thank you very much, Luke. And you asked great questions, even though you only got my paper, my rudimentary PowerPoint yesterday. So well done. Yes, exactly. The question, so what, is a question I skipped at the outset for the sake of time. Why is it worthwhile researching this question? Such global numbers are frequently quoted by politicians and journalists when whoever states them. And in the past, before those three studies were there, nobody could really get to the roots. Where do the numbers come from? But still they were circulated and widely quoted and then debated, and people said they're not reliable. So because such numbers are widely quoted, I wanted to go really to the roots and in depth. And obviously, if we say this is a global phenomenon, if we can say, okay, this is roughly how many people are affected by it, that might have some weight, possibly. Okay, so there are different layers. Dennis pointed us more toward the local level, looking at things under magnifying glass. Then we have the, let's call it the intermediate level, looking at things on a national level. And then we have this level of transnational comparison or looking at a global level. And each of this level and layers has its own justification, and it depends for what it needs to be used. So I would say it is not sufficient just to look at the national level and to neglect the global total picture. But I'm supposed to be brief, sorry. Second, about the different measurements, estimates. Obviously, I will look at each of those three in more detail in the analysis section. And then, because they all have different dates too, or are looking at different time frames, then I'm trying to see, can I all synchronize them on one time frame by adding data and then see how they would compare, if that makes sense at all. And then looking at a range, well, just as a preliminary thing, if Todd Johnson says in those 46 countries which were the main perpetrators in 2012, this is how many people lived there in the year 2020. Was it, did he say 600 million? Okay, then let's roughly say, okay, that's the top of the margin. If all Christians living in those countries were affected, then this would be the total number. And now Open Doors is known for a very conservative approach, always trying not to overestimate numbers and rather underestimate numbers in order not to expose themselves. So when Open Doors research comes to an estimate that at least, was it then 320 that we got to? 320 million Christians are affected in 2020. Then we have an initial guess at a range, and obviously looking with a magnifying glass at each of those approaches and their possible shortcomings and margins of error, etc., then we might adjust those figures further. So that's a very preliminary answer.
Okay, yeah, do you have a further point, or
there was a third question which actually leads
just
beyond.
brief then? Yes, yeah.
Briefly, a colleague and I, Werner Nell, we have written a paper on definitions of persecution, and they're very different definitions in different realms. And obviously there is real persecution is defined by a whole number of factors that can be externally verified. And that is something very different from a mere perceived threat, at least perceived threat in terms of a mental illness. In German, Verfolgungskomplex. If you think you're being persecuted, but you're not. But obviously, there's also a level in society that people might perceive they're persecuted. But if you have a number of variables that define what persecution means, then you would exclude such merely perceived threats that are not real threats. Let's leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you. I have three persons who would like to ask a question, but I would just like to invite them to pose them, and then you can try to combine the various questions in your final answer then, Christoph. The first one I have is Jonathan, and then without further ado, Thomas can take the floor, and then Jim Wallace. So Jonathan, you are first.
Okay, thank you. I really have more of a comment, and I'm not saying this because it's my data set, but were you aware that the Religion and State data set has a minorities module where we collect data on discrimination against pretty much every religious minority in 183 countries, and this obviously includes Christian minorities, including Christian minorities in Christian countries, say Protestants in a Catholic or Orthodox country. The data's there. You could easily match it up with population data and calculate a number. I've never done that, but it would be relatively straightforward to do.
Okay, thank you. So that's a response to your general invitation. If there are more data sets available, then please inform me. Yes, okay, Thomas?
Yes, Christoph, that's a very daring task, and I'm already looking forward to read this article. I suspect the most important words or the most important term in the whole article may be at least 320 or whatever number. Because my comment is if you take the open doors numbers, please don't forget that even below the 73 number of countries, there are still countries where we have persecution, because one of the limitations is that we are scoring only whole countries. So, for example, the Philippines do not show up in this list of 73 countries, but we have definitely persecuted Christians in there. So this is just my comment that we do not overlook these minorities, or actually it's a Christian country, but still, yeah, mostly we are talking about converts. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
Yes, I just wanted to mention that a couple of years ago, there was a conference held at Gordon College in Boston on religion in China with the leading demographers, including Todd Johnson and others. But they looked at a lot of data and ways of extracting the correct information on China. One of the studies cited was very much an outlier, but the others were within a reasonable range. I will send you the information on who to contact to hopefully get a hold of that, because you said China, the results on China would have a skewed effect on the whole study. So I'll send you that and you can follow up.
Great, thanks. Crystal, you want to have a final short response to that?
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. And first to Jonathan Fox, it is a great privilege to be in a conference together with you. And I thought your data might actually be very useful. And I have bought a whole number of your books. I just didn't get down to consuming it all. And because of my move, all the books are packed up currently. So thank you very much for opening this up to me. I have one question in the back of my mind. The minorities module focuses on minorities, but actually in a whole number of national security states, Christians are the majority. So I wonder whether they would feature in your module.
Can I answer that quickly?
Yep.
Not in that module, but in country, I have a variable in the general data set, restrictions on the majority religion, which would be relevant to any country where Christians are in the majority.
Okay, I'll be very happy to continue liaising with you, Jonathan.
Great.
Lovely. Okay, to Thomas, thank you very much for adding a factor that I had not mentioned yet, that there is also persecution below the 70 countries that Open Doors is currently studying. And obviously the question we need to raise, how significant are they numerically in total? All those groups within countries that are under significant persecution, whereas the whole country is not. And concerning China, I just used China as an example of several countries with significant Christian populations that are under pressure. And obviously, if you have a large proportion of the world population in just a handful of countries, whatever happens in those countries, whatever global figures you want, or whatever issue you want to look at, it's always those countries that disproportionately influence your outcomes. So I just wanted to highlight that as an awareness. So I stop here. Thank you very much for your kind feedback.
Okay, well, thank you, Christoph, and we wish you all the best with the hardships of moving around and then having to do without your books. But perhaps you can. We hope that you can soon hand in your the first draft of your full paper. So thank you very much. This concludes basically our online conference, which I think was a wonderful experience. I think for me, the first of this size and international width that I've been attending. So thank you very much. Thank you all. I think it is good to have some further comments from the editors of the journal. Dennis gave already his kind of brief timeline in his most recent mail. Say well that we intend to have comments with you from this first round on June 15. And then there are 6 weeks basically to make your second draft. But we have still to include as well the blind review. So I think we should discuss that a little bit further separately with I think with Janet and Christoph. I think to see exactly what can be the exact timeline. So those of you who have not been able to have a full paper yet, I think would certainly encourage to hand that in as soon as possible. And then, I think the exact process we still have to kind of do the fine tuning there. But I think the date of August 1st, I think, is an important date as far as I can see. But we will be in touch, I think, within a couple of days with all of you. So I don't know whether there are further comments at this stage, either from Dennis or Janet or who else on this. Otherwise, I think I would like to conclude with thanking you all. This, I think, was a great event in a very different way than we had anticipated earlier, but I think as fruitful, certainly as fruitful as that. And now many more people could attend in this way than would have been able to go to Amsterdam for a physical workshop there. So I think that was really great. Dennis, I think we can send around the link that enables people to attend if they want to the defense of your dissertation upcoming Friday. So that as well will be a digital event, which is for me as well the first time to have a digital dissertation defense. It will take just exactly 1 hour, so in that sense it will not be very time consuming. And I know in the United States it can take sometimes hours and hours. This will be just exact 60 minutes. So you are welcome to join this. Okay. If there is there another final closing comment, Dennis, for you or others?
Yes, Govert, I just would like to join you in thanking everyone for participating in this expert seminar, and also thanking the authors for being part of this important project. So I will send an email with the link to the live stream of my PhD defense for those who are interested. But most importantly, I will send out some additional instructions about the peer review process that will follow. So these discussions we've had today and last week, that's why we recorded them, are part of an open peer review process, but that will have to be complemented by a blind peer review process that will obviously take some time, but will ensure also quality, sufficient quality of the papers. So I'll be in touch about that. And I also just wanted to express that this kind of meeting was actually quite fruitful. I think that's a feeling we all share, and maybe I just want to leave this as an idea. Maybe we could make this a kind of permanent discussion group that comes together maybe once every 3 months or something like that. That could be an idea also, or even more frequently, I don't know. Just leave that as an idea to all of you. But the first task ahead is to finalize the papers for the special issue. So thank you all once again. Thank you also Christoph and Janet particularly. Thank you Jonathan and Govert for helping me get here to defend my dissertation, because you have been my supervisor throughout this process. Yeah, I look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you and bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I speak a little bit English, but I learned a lot of more.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I'm from Colombia.
Yeah, I saw your chat. I saw it in your chat. Yes. So you perhaps during another meeting you should present something.
I need to write for email.
Okay.
Excuse me?
Mm-hmm.